I start at the top and then I watch the wash and see how it moves. If it moves like I expect it to, which is starts to carry downward, then that's great. I don't need to add any water or do anything with the spray bottle. I can just add color as I see fit. And I'm deepening the right side of the painting. I'm going a little darker with the blue. In essence, this is to create the sense that the light is moving in from the left side of the painting. As I finish, I'm using a don't want to overdo it. That's what logic is. Today we're going to start with graded washes. We're going to practice graded washes to warm us up, to get us thinking about how we're going to capture the light on this hillside cemetery, and to prepare us for the watercolor painting. Okay, so we're going to create a graded wash on our paper here. You see I've placed a piece of tape down the middle. We're going to do 2 washes to emulate the sort of light that we're trying to create in our hillside cemetery painting. And a couple brushes, I don't know if I'm going to use all of these, but you notice they're good size. A big flat, this is a 1-inch made from Sablette, and 2 squirrel mops. The bigger mop is good for this size. For adding extra color, a smaller mop is good, or even a Sablette. And this is also a good brush because it helps to blend a little bit. So there's a number of ways we can build it up. What I like to do is start somewhere in the middle. Well, in this case, it depends on the transition we're trying to recreate, honestly. So I want to start with my cerulean blue and bring it down and gradually add some yellow ochre to that, so that I get a graded wash that is going from blue to yellow, cool to warm, a little darker to a little lighter on the horizon. That's the goal, and we'll just do it all the way down. And I've got cerulean blue here, which is a greener blue. Let me clean up this residue here because that's going to take away from the wash a little bit. Pretty easy to clean this palette. I just take a little water, and with the paper towel I can lift out any color that's there. If I really want a bright, pure version, that's what I do. And we go about building this. Build up a bit of color here so that we have a little puddle down here. And at the same time, I'm going to start to prepare the yellow ochre. It doesn't hurt to have some color ready to go, because our technique, this technique of creating a graded wash, is dependent on a wet condition of the paint and paper. For it to mix with gravity, we need to have it wet. There we go. Okay. Same idea, take a little bit of pigment and dilute it with water in the palette. Dilute it well, really break it down. Because I have fresh paint on the palette, so You want to make sure that it's well mixed, well diluted. You can tell it's very diluted the way it runs down. All right, I think that's good enough. Oh, they want to mix here. I see. Okay. I'm taking a fairly strong mixture and starting with this big mop brush up on top of the paper. And as I bring it down, you see a bead is forming, or a little gathering of color towards the bottom. This is expected, it's what we want it to do. While it's wet, I can bring some thicker paint up to the top here, knowing that it's going to be pulled down, and gradually I can dilute that. So that we get sort of a smooth transition of color. Almost becoming just water towards the bottom here. Smooth transition of color, that's what we're after. Sometimes we can use our water bottle to help us out. And we have a nice bead of on the bottom there, so that tells me I have a little time. If I want to make an adjustment up here, I can do that, putting in a little darker color. And provoking that, just asking it to drift down the page. So the first part of our graded wash has started successfully. Now we want to introduce the yellow ochre. Dilute some here. I'm going to start it just below this, because I know I have some time, and because I want to keep a little bit of purity there before I start down. And I'm just going to take the lightest amount, like this, bring it right up, even let it go into the blue a little bit. So we get a pretty smooth transition there. That's what we're after. These transitions are useful for a number of scenarios. In general, they help us to create a sense of migrating light, moving light, light bounce, different times of day. As I finish, I'm using a more yellow ochre to try and get a very heavy golden color at the bottom here. Gravity is going to continue to pull this down. Use this brush to maybe smooth things out a little bit. But I think you're observing that there's a transition from dark to lighter to very light to dark in this one wash. Excuse me. And this is sort of the effect that we'll be after in doing our sky in the painting of the cemetery. So this is waking up our watercolor sense and telling us, how things are moving today. Every day seems to be a little different, and the way that we paint is really changes day to day too. So this is sort of a precursor to me that things are drying a little slowly, and My sense is generally very good, pretty good. I feel good about the transition and the timing. So I learned a little bit by doing this wash, just by jumping in. There's no real stress in this because we're just trying to emulate something technically. Just thinking about the technique of building up this graded wash. In the next wash, we're going to do a little more complex wash using this structure in the upper part and then going from yellow ochre to a deeper green in the lower part. We're going to try and achieve that sort of dome-like effect in the sky and the plane of the ground going to meet that in our ground area. So let's start. This is contaminating, so I have to move this down here. I think I'll do the blue down here. Normally I don't mind that, but for this exercise, I'd prefer it if it was a little pure. I do have to be mindful of this bead because if I don't pick that up, if I let it just continue to gather, it's going to get soaked up and create cauliflower because the area above is drying faster than the area below. Like this is very fragile right now. So the drying time is slower today, but I still have to be mindful of that bead below. Right. So we're going to create our sky to about here. And then below is going to be, as I said, this area of grass. Let's do it in the same way. Just start with, let's do it down here. Just starting with cerulean blue. This big mop brush, you notice, carries a lot of liquid to the page very quickly, which is ideal because I want to keep this area wet. Right now it's very pale. I'd like to make that darker. Cerulean blue, I've found that it's a little more in tune with the autumn sky, the colors that we see in autumn. What I'm doing now is just picking up more of the cerulean paint and putting it in the topmost inch. Then I'll take some of this diluted color and start to bring it down. So we're just basically with water here. And the yellow ochre. I don't really want this really deep, rich yellow ochre. I want a more diluted yellow ochre right below, and we just work it up like that so that the blue can migrate down a little bit and we keep a rather pure yellow ochre below. If I notice my wash is getting matte or losing its shine, I will put on a little bit of water, as you saw. Just a little more of that yellow ochre through here. This is basically the sky for our scene, for autumn light. Could be even paler to really emulate that autumn feel, but it's going to dry lighter. Look at that transition, almost perfect. And water's doing most of the work here. The part that we need to be concerned about is the timing. Okay, let's move on to creating a second wash here. Using yellow ochre again. Pale towards the back. Just going to leave a little bit of white. Pale towards the back. as we come down, getting a little darker. Like this. Then we take a bit of green. Still some green in the grass in October. For this, I'm going to try a little different brush. That brush is going to allow me to do some dry brush, even though it's wet here. I can take in some of this deeper green. Because I want there to be a little rough texture in this passage. It's still basically a graded wash. Leaving little spots of the yellow ochre showing through. Maybe we put even a little bit of blue with this. And the reason we're developing this strong dark at the bottom is to create the feeling of a plane moving back. This is coming towards us, so we need this dark quality to make it to come towards us. I'm going to leave that yellow ochre for the moment. And this is sort of the preparation for our painting for the day. Right now, my paper is still a little damp. Here, nearly dried. Yeah, dry enough. Okay. So in our background, if you looked at our image, we have a background of trees and a steeple or a distant church. And that's the next thing that I'd like to paint into this work, is to show you how we would paint distant trees. I wonder if I can do that here. Distant trees and a church. Maybe I'll try that here. So in this case, the gradient is going to be moving this way from a yellow, a grade yellow to a grade blue. Let's see if I can emulate that for you. So we use some of the yellow ochre. A little thicker. Feels pretty dry. Mine is pretty dry. So I'm going to start by creating this foliage. Remember, it's distant foliage. I'm just painting silhouettes of those trees. Some low trees here. Just big shapes of trees, distant trees. right? Now, let's create using some leftovers or cerulean blue. Need a lot of that. I just want a bluish gray, so I'm going to move over here to the ultramarine. About the same value as my yellow. And I'm going to paint a steeple. The steeple of our distant church. Might as well leave some lines there. Not too fancy. We don't need a lot. Anyway, same sort of idea, only done with objects. A little bit of a graded wash from the yellow to the blue. Nothing fancy, as I said. All this does is create a different sense of material, a feeling that these are a little bit against the light. In other words, not too much shading or detail. On top of this, we place a tree or a fence, some of the stones of the cemetery. But this is the basic structure to help us think about creating our backdrop to the scene. That's basically what we're doing here. Let's try it once more. Just a little paler. I'll try to make it a little grayer. So a little bit of yellow here in these distant trees. Just getting that feeling of a grove of trees, nothing more. Replace it, this color of our cool gray, our warm, the gray of the steeple and the church. About the same value. And we build up the steeple. Thinking about doing it in a painterly way. And we put a little more blue in the top part. Well, now we have a bell tower. See, just by missing a stroke, we complete a whole new version of our steeple. And a little yellow ochre and some foliage through here. So we vary it once more. This perhaps feels a little more in harmony, a little more distant, because we have the organization of our trees along that pale yellow and the steeple against that pale yellow. So it's a little more strong. Even though it's a lighter version, it comes out more strongly because of that pale background. So we're starting to set the scene for our painting and making use of graded washes from top to bottom, getting a little feeling of the forward motion, and laterally, a little brighter, a little more yellow in the foliage over here, in the stone structure of the church, a little bluer and a little darker, so we get a feeling of light moving this way too. All right, I think we're well prepared now to move on to our painting. Well, I'm drawing out my subject now, and basically concerned about these big shapes of the distant church, the distant foliage, the kind of up and down nature of our ground level, placing the big oak tree, this old oak tree. How much drawing to do for this is really, I would say, up to everybody's own discretion. One thing that I do look for is the character of the oak tree, which is really broad at the bottom and then kind of breaking off into a multitude of branches, rather low in the trunk. This is typical of the white oak. Just branches can go anywhere. We can really design the tree as we wish. But I want scale, I want a big feeling to the tree. I want the main divisions to come rather low on the tree. I want to see a little bit of the lower part, even though it's obscured by the wall and some of the headstones. I want to get an idea of how it enters the ground. Then it's a matter of placing headstones. And my main headstones are a couple right here. And then I'll think about a pattern. They go slightly higher than the wall. Some are tilted. And they're scattered. They're not really. I'm thinking about how to use them effectively in a composition. I want to have a lot of light coming in through here. We have a major one, kind of repeating the shape of our steeple, so that's a positive. It also helps to create depth. We'll put it in the corner here, and some shadows coming along the bottom, and I think that's our design right there. I don't really see, I see some small things to perhaps improve on it, like leaning the stones a little more. But I don't see anything major improving that arrangement. It's kind of a nice connection of darks through here. Maybe just a little lower. Okay. And this is, as we repeat some shapes, yes, they do get a little smaller in the distance. Let me get this right here. Nice shadow coming across this one. Here too. So that gives us one more reference to the light. Some of the branches will be casting shadows as well, but we'll leave that to the brushwork. Any more trees? We could bring in one from the corner. We've got distant trees. I think we're good. So let's start with our first washes. I'm going to state the drawing just a little more succinctly. We got some overlapping shapes here, which is always good. Overlapping shapes, the stones against the trees. Is this going to be a good one? This might be a good one to put here. The stones themselves are casting shadows, but they're all very narrow, kind of moving off to the right. I think this is good. Most concerned about this area. This is my central area, my center of interest, as it were. All this stuff is meeting here. Darks against other darks, some bright lights through here, movement from right to left. Let's get about setting up our washes. I'm going to put just a few lines to indicate branches through here, because I'm going to pull some of those out while the paint is wet. This tree was the most remarkable subject, and so I'm giving it a lot of attention, as you can tell. We have a distant tree over here, maybe. I don't know. Main stuff is there. Let's move forward. Well, you see some changes that I've made in the design. Primarily, I've taken a vertical and made it into a horizontal. I felt this allowed me to show the tree with a little more strength and vitality, and this is, after all, one of the main reasons I'm doing this painting is to preserve this big oak tree. And I'm still able to organize the picture around that with some stones and the cathedral in the back. So I feel I've given myself a good chance to do the painting. So I'm going to be using the palette I talked about, cerulean blue, a little bit of ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, hooker's green, and burnt sienna. For the 99% of the painting, I might introduce a little bit of a jaune brilliant at the end for some highlights. I might use another color somewhere, but those are the basic colors that I want. My palette, I'm going to start in the same way that we started our exercise, which is the graded washes. So let's have a go. Well, we have our drawing in front of us, and we're going to begin by starting with the lightest graded wash. Well, we're going for the sky, of course, and in this graded wash, the goal here is to kind of create the same sort of transition that we did in our drill. I'm doing it a slightly different way, and truly either way works well. The way I'm going to build up this wash is I'm going to start with the yellow ochre about halfway down, and then as I carry the wash upward, I'm going to start to lighten it. You see I've got a couple brushes here, a big wide flat, 1-inch flat, and a couple of mop brushes. These are useful for These brushes are useful because they carry a lot of pigment to the paper and allow me to manipulate the pigment while it's still wet, shaping the graded wash as I deem necessary. And on this size of paper, that size of brush is necessary because we're working a large area. We're going to be painting about 2/3 of the paper with this wash, so we need to carry a lot of liquid to the paper. All right, so starting with my yellow ochre across the whole drawing. I'm not cutting around anything. I'm painting very lightly, and it's going to dry quite light, so I'll still be able to see the drawing, and any brights that I need I can still pull out, or I can use this yellow color. And you see as I go higher, I'm making the wash lighter. So I do that by just adding a little water to the brush. And now I've practically got the whole half of the paper covered very quickly. That's the strength of this mop brush, is that you can carry a lot of liquid to the paper and do this big wash very quickly. You can see how it's glistening. The wash is glistening. It's that shiny quality is something that I look for because I know that I can still manipulate the wash, and I intend to manipulate it by dropping in this cerulean blue from the top. Now my board is at quite an angle, so it's going to run down, and I want to control that, so I start at the top and then I watch the wash and see how it moves. If it moves like I expect it to, which is starts to carry downward, then that's great. I don't need to add any water or do anything with the spray bottle. I can just add color as I see fit. And I'm deepening the right side of the painting. I'm going a little darker with the blue. In essence, this is to create the sense that the light is moving in from the left side of the painting and across the paper to the right side. So then I just extend the yellow wash downward, and I'm able to do this because the wash is still very, very wet, shiny, and it allows me to just add a little pigment and a little water to the bottom of the wash and pull it down. Since I'm using yellow ochre, this wash is seamless, and that's what I'm hoping for. So I do expect to do some deeper work along the bottom, so I don't mind going with a little extra yellow ochre into that area and start to prepare for that darker application. And I don't want to do too much more though, because it's looking as I hoped. It's giving me that transition. I feel like the blue is coming down. There's a little soft yellow at the horizon, a warmth to the whole sky, because remember, we carried a bit of yellow ochre upwards before we added the blue. So the yellow is coming through everything. That warmth is even coming through the blue color. That's ideal because we're trying to capture that warm October sky. And nothing does that better than yellow ochre and other warm tones. So now what I'm doing is starting to prepare to paint the foreground. The foreground basically is where I plan to show some of the headstones, show the beginning of the oak tree, the end of the fence. So I'm leaving just a little gap in this wash, a little passage of white that basically resembles or indicates where the fence is going to start. And I leave that actually through the whole length of the painting. A little bit of burnt sienna. The goal in this second part of the wash is to strengthen the lower part of the foreground so that we get a feeling of depth in the painting. Even though we haven't added any objects yet, we can still start to create the depth by introducing the burnt sienna that you see, some of the hooker's green that I'm adding now, and I'll manipulate this until I get the resulting combination that I expect will look good. The temptation at this stage is to try to finish things or bring things to a finished state. That's because, well, it's where we're starting. We're starting our painting, and so it's natural for us to want to start to see some finish or some depth to the painting. And it's I think I need to resist this a little bit, because at this stage I'm just trying to create the atmosphere or the air that's going to hold all these objects. So bringing in that graded wash in from the sky and creating something in the foreground is really the only goal that I have. That's all I need at this point. The pigment keeps flowing down, so I feel I need to add a bit more stronger pigment, some stronger siennas, and even some stronger blue-greens to the bottom so that it doesn't dry too pale. Here's where that perhaps the mop brush is not as useful, because it carries not only pigment but carries a lot of water to the paper, and it can be deceptive. The wash looks very good right now, but I know that it's going to dry quite a bit lighter, and I would like to achieve something like this in the finish of the foreground, so I'm going to have to add some deeper colors to the foreground. That means a little more hooker's green mixed with blue, a little bit of burnt sienna. Now that burnt sienna does a good job in giving us the sort of tainted green or the weathered green that we want in the foreground. And you also notice I'm leaving a little patch of white left and right. These my plan is to turn them into fallen leaves, some leaves that have gathered on the tops of the grass and are catching the light because they're kind of bent upwards. So I'll reshape those as the painting dries and indicate individual leaves, so that we get a complete sensation of fall. The oak tree has lost its leaves to the ground, and we can see a few of them drifting by, gathered on the grass and by the stones. Well, now it's starting to look about the tone that's going to work, I believe. After this dries, we will be adding shadows, but I want to get the foundation set so that I don't have to return to this if I don't have to. All right, let's let this dry, and then we'll move on to the second half. The painting is dried off, and you can see how much that lower section is lightened. We do have that plane pretty well established, though. We feel like it's coming towards us in a gradual manner. All the edges right now in our painting are soft edges, so it's very atmospheric, and this is inviting me to paint. I really feel ready and have some forethought as to what I want to do here in getting started. And I'm going to be working on dry paper and starting to establish that midground of trees and next the cathedral that's next to it. Very much the same process that we used in creating our drill. Starting with a yellow ochre, a little bit of leftovers, and the brushwork here is important because I'm trying to create sort of a stand of trees. I'll introduce a little bit of fall color to the trees, and all while it's wet so that I get some nice soft edges, kind of blooming color within the trees. But that overall shape, leaving a few gaps in the strokes so that we feel we're looking through the trees. Same time we feel like they're receding and towards the edge, and some are coming forward. Adding a bit of cadmium yellow. This is going to dry a little stronger, show us some of that bright autumn foliage that we enjoy this time of year, as well as some of the cad orange red, and I'm placing that into the wet paint so that it spreads out, and the result will be sort of a soft glowing area of color against this pale sky. And this is going to connect all the way to the right hand side with the foliage that's coming in front of the tree, a little bit of bushes or whatever. And then on top of that, we'll build the profile, the shape of our cathedral. And this is pretty simply indicated using the shape of a box, basically the square structure of the building with a little peak to the roof. And the real telltale sign will be the spire, or the spire. For this work, I'm using a large sablette brush, and since I'm in a small area and want to work rather dry and have some brushwork coming through, this has been the right choice. A mop brush would have been a little too big, a little too much liquid. This I have a little more control over the transitions and the edges that I'm expressing the foliage with, as well as the cathedral. Yeah, so you see me working on that square shape, and notice that though the color's changing, the tonality, the light and dark quality of the shape is, all these shapes are very close. The foliage, the trees on the left, and the spire, the cathedral with the steeple, the spire, all the same value, even though the color changes. And the photograph doesn't really show us this. It's got more of a broken shape to it where the sun is striking. And I just find this simpler to do, and for some reason the simplicity brings it a little strength. I like just the idea of painting this pale silhouette against the sky, knowing that I'm going to be passing some dark branches in front of everything, and building up some of the stones to actually push back against all of this. Right now, of course, it does feel understated. It feels simplistic, but this is a good example of what you want your background to do. It's a supporting character. It's giving us a bit of a context and something in the distance, not just sky. So for all intensive purposes, this is just enough. And what we need to do beyond this is to consider how dark to go with our tree and some of the headstones that lead up to the foliage and the fence and the church. So I think this is a good example, something to think about with your background. When it comes to an area that's a background, you actually need to take away a little of the interest, and that goes for a photograph, that goes for what you see in nature. This is not as easy as it sounds or as natural as it sounds, because our eyes focus where they land. So while we're looking at the tree, we see all this wonderful detail, shadows, and bark and branches and leaves. when we then look to the distance, we see the same thing, only it's much further away. Smaller, of course, but the point I'm trying to make is we have to go beyond what we see and think about the whole picture, the big picture, how the background is relating to our subject, and adjust it accordingly. And this way we can create the magic that we see in painting and take it beyond what a photograph will tell us. Well, what I'm doing here is I'm starting to paint that marvelous old oak tree that stands in the cemetery, and who knows how old it is. I don't know, but it's been around for a long time. It's just massive, and the way that it's grown is quite expressive and just is perfect for doing these sorts of dry brush strokes. So, of course, that attracts me as a painter to want to capture that with some strong brushwork. At the same time, be true to the character of the oak tree, which is typical. It kind of divides lower down. The trunk itself is very short. The big trunk is very short, and then it starts to make these divisions. The branches start to divide. So I'm aware of that, and maybe even exaggerating that a little bit in this painting. I'm also trying to pick up on the expansiveness of the branches and the way they twist and turn. And why I'm not painting it branch for branch, I am looking for a mark that resembles what I'm seeing. And what's helping me to achieve that is the sort of dry brush technique that you see me using, where the brush runs out of paint and leaves a sort of broken stroke, and then where I see a joint or a shadow, I take a wetter brush there and get a stronger application. But I'm doing it at this stage because I want it to mesh with the background, just extend the background up into the sky. So there is a continuity of tone even at this early state. You see me returning now and then with my fingernail and pulling out little marks. These marks are the highlights of the roots that are just starting to enter the ground, or branches that are passing in front of shadow areas. And there's not an abundance of these, but a few to help remind me that I need to leave some lights as I create the branches and create this effect of a bright branch coming in front of a darker branch. I think that will will contribute to the sense of light that's being created in the scene. Okay. Well, I'm pleased so far with the natural progression from the light sky. Look at how that gradient has dried and given us that transition from left to right as well as from top to bottom. It really subtly states the sort of atmosphere that we have today. In the foreground, perhaps a bit too much green. Not something we can really worry about now. It's there. So we just work with it, and it'll be okay in the end. If I had it to do over again, I'd probably use more yellows and oranges and siennas to get a little drier effect. Now the brushwork is still relatively wet in this tree. I want to add some darker touches to pull limbs forward and give a little more substantial quality to the big limbs, the big branches that are starting off of the trunk. And this brush is great because all I need to do is press the heel into the paper a little bit to widen the mark. I can use the same brush then, which has the exact color that I want, and start to work from the tip and carry the branch a little higher or further outward. This particular area of Massachusetts, there's a number of what I would say are great cemeteries. We're not far from Sleepy Hollow, which is in near Concord, and in that particular cemetery, there's of course a lot of famous, famous authors. There's one area called Authors Row, where Emerson, Thoreau, who else? Emerson, Thoreau, Longfellow, Hawthorne. Let me think. I'm drawing some blanks. Alcott, I believe Louisa May Alcott is there also. And other notables. And I only mention that because I'm sort of remembering my visit there, and a lot of people travel there just to see their stones and actually take a rubbing. It's popular to take a piece of paper and a piece of charcoal and to take an impression from the stone. People will come. Well, I had a group come from Japan, and this group was very much into American literature of that time, and so it was a very important part of their visit to go to the cemetery and take a rubbing from the stone, something they could bring back with them, having visited the area that these people were writing about, seen some of the things that were in their literature, visit the sort of structure that they lived in. It's all within a few miles. That's what makes this part of Massachusetts really special. Well, you see I've continued to add a little more of that sienna color and finding a comfort level with the brush, holding it by the end and starting to drag it outward and use the tip a little more so that I can get some broken branches, some fine branches as it moves outward. I have to be careful about making this trunk a little too wide. Right now it's blending in with everything, but I can see a little danger in making it too wide, so I'm going to be careful about that. And even though these stones are separated and there's distance between the tree and the wall and the distant foliage, I want there to be a certain connection too between the tones. So you see me mixing color and then building up the stones the headstones, and I'm going to be using just a slightly darker version of this mid-tone, connecting the mid-tone through the painting before I move on to the strong darks. The colors that I'm drawing on I'm using actually a lot of cerulean blue in this gray. This is one way to keep the color harmonious, is by repeating the primaries that we're using. And the primaries would be the yellow, which is yellow ochre, or the red, which is that cadmium red, or cadmium orange red, or the blue, which is the cerulean blue. And if we repeat these in our mixtures, even if we add other colors, such as now I'm adding a little bit of Payne's gray, um, or a little bit of burnt sienna, if we kind of stay within these simple colors, the painting will end up being more harmonious than if we try to um, mix in too many different colors. I like the way the stones rise to meet the background, and rise to meet the oak tree. It makes it feel a little closer, like we're closer to the ground, or that we're looking uphill slightly. And that's one of the sensations that I want to create here. And at this stage, I'm not trying to distinguish necessarily the individual stones. If they intersect and form kind of a joined shape, that's fine with me. I do intend to return with some darker touches, especially on the stones that I want to bring forward. But I'm thinking of it very much in stages and realize that I don't have to finish things at this stage. I can rather spend the time joining things and extending shapes in a way that's pleasing to me, and then refine them and detail them in a later state. So I am trying to create that composition that I want, that was in the drawing, where this grouping of stones is coming lower in the painting and pushing everything back. This allows the tree to dry. It allows the background, of course, to dry too, so that by the time we finish this lower section, we can feel more confident and work with dry brush technique up into the oak tree and in the branches, as well as bringing some textures to the ground and to the area of stones that we're working on now. And I hope you can appreciate the thickness of the paint I'm using. There's very little water right now. I'm not using a strong dark, but there's very little water. That gives me a lot of control too, and allows me to occasionally to evoke a little bit of the texture or the dry brush that I want on the stones or on the ground. I am keen about getting a little bit of a bluish quality, sort of saying that the sky color, it's finding its way into the shadows of these stones. And so there's a relationship between what we've done in the sky, what we've done in the cathedral, and the color that's coming out in our headstones. Pretty much painting these in the same arrangement that we see in the photograph. I might be bringing this a bit lower than it is in the photograph, but basically the relationships are there. That was one of the reasons I took the photo, was because I liked that particular um, arrangement. This particular cemetery is an old one, so the stones are, a lot of them actually have been worn to the point where you almost don't see the lettering or the names anymore. And they're tilted, they're chipped, they're worn by the rain. They have that sort of quality. And while we're not really going to show that exact nature, a little bit of the rough texture and the tilted quality, the uneven sizes and spacings, very different from what you will see in a modern cemetery where things tend to be a little more regulated. This is a much more random feeling, which is appealing, and we see that more in older cemeteries. We have another great cemetery in Boston, actually Cambridge, called Mount Auburn Cemetery, and it's really a treat to visit any time of year because of the grounds. The grounds are just so beautiful. Some of the examples of the trees and foliage that you'll see, you can't see anywhere else. It's really just magnificent, and it's all cared for very well. If you get past seeing all the stones and thinking about where you are too much, you can really feel comfortable painting there. Well, now you see me bringing in these shadows from a tree that we don't see. The tree is on the left side, casting some long shadows across from the left, some of them reaching to the stones, some of them just traversing the grass. And again, kind of joining forces with the graded application in the background in the sky to create the movement of light that we want, a feeling that the light is strong on the left and really traversing our scene from left to right, both in the sky, on the distant background, and on this hillside. For this particular mixture, I'm using a darker blue mixed with a little bit of brown. The darker blue is ultramarine, but I'm not using it very strongly, so it registers as a cool gray, a cool dark gray, which is what I'm hoping for. And this is also helping me graphically in terms of the picture to join the darks. So the midtones, you remember we made an effort to connect the midtones through the painting from the distant foliage up through the tree down into the stones. And now you see an effort to connect the darks, which are shadows that are falling on the ground, connected with the stones, and eventually brought into the big oak tree as well. This is the area that I left unpainted, and with the thought that I would come back as I'm doing now and add some shadows under leaves or a feeling of individual leaves gathered in this particular area. And at the end, too, I will add some leaves to create the illusion of a lawn that's strewn with leaves, with autumn leaves. Using an even smaller brush now to bring a little age to this stone, a little weathered age in using some sepia into the wet area, the wet, cool area of the stone, creating a base that really sits nicely on the corner. And again, the whole stone is pushing back against the background, so functioning really well to give us that sensation that we're right in the middle of the cemetery. There are some things I'd like to do while the paint is wet. Uh, Even these stones have a little graded wash added to them. If you can tell, they're a little darker at the base and a little lighter as they move upward. This also creates the effect of what we call light bounce, when light is kind of thrown back to an object from the ground and creates a feeling that a little lighter feeling in the stone. So this is the nature of light. It's moving everywhere, not just from the sun, but it's also bouncing off of objects. Color too moves in that way. So when we work with color, we can actually explore that by randomly placing some of the red or some of the green in a place that you might not expect it. It makes sense in the end because this is the nature of light, and the nature of color is this constant sort of bouncing from object to object, even into the atmosphere. Well, we're starting to bring some of our darks into the stones as well as into the tree now. And the reason for doing this is to bring a little more of a three-dimensional quality to the tree by painting shadows, and also to bring a little stronger sensation of the light. When we paint dark shadows into our objects, suddenly the light is amplified. The light feels twice as intense. And so we need dark. We must have dark to create light. And I'm using a small kind of worn brush for this that I can use in a dry brush fashion. And I'm looking to accentuate where the branches are turning. In essence, where they come off of, where one branch comes off of another branch, or when the branch turns, is a good place to suggest a little more dark. A photograph does not really give us that sort of information. It may if we look closely, but it's hard to pick that out. So in this case, I'm sort of trusting my instinct, and where I want a branch to come forward, that's where I add a small dark, and I try to blend it into the surrounding midtone. All the shadow work is being done with the warm gray, using a little bit of sepia, a little bit of red with that, really trying to create warmth in the scene so that we feel that late afternoon, the fall, October light. This painting could almost be a portrait of this oak tree. And, if we saw it from a different angle, it could easily become that. It just was such an interesting shape. The way the shape moved through the space was just exquisite, and we can't create every nuance, but we can get the essence if we pay attention on a few things. So I'm being really methodical now. I'm not trying to do anything big, just looking at the subject and determining if I can add an accent here, if an accent's going to make sense, moving on to the next one, and so on, back and forth. And I feel happy with those first branches because in essence, they create the essence of the tree. Adding the smaller branches is helpful and helps to put on that finishing touch. But more important is the main branches and how they create that really upward moving feeling, the twisting feeling, the outspread limbs as well. Well, the branches are starting to take more the three-dimensional quality, and also we're starting to see a little bit more. We're starting to feel a stronger light behind the tree and to the left of the tree. Brushwork here is sort of blended, but it's being laid on top of strokes that came about in a sort of gestural quality. So it's basically refining that stroke or refining that limb so that we get that feeling that it's coming forward or even moving away from us. That's what we're trying to create now. It's a little more depth, a little more three-dimensional quality to the tree. And everything is dried behind, so we can progress on dry paper without any fear of, you know, a soft edge where we don't want it. Okay. This is sort of like doing our windows last week. A little bit tedious, painstaking, but in the end it gives us the likeness to the tree, and it also helps to create that dry atmosphere that we're looking for. Basically using the same colors of sienna, burnt sienna, a little sepia, warm hues, a little bit of the cerulean blue mixed in to keep it sort of in the mid-range, and to gray the color. That's an important part too. I don't want it to be too bright. Warm is fine, but not too bright. To connect that branch to the side is quite important because it sort of finalizes the space that's between the branch and the ground, and we get a clearer idea of the distance, and then the light also is concentrated. As I'm painting this, of course, I'm remembering um, some of the great trees that I've seen over the years, not necessarily in nature, but of particular, I'm thinking of some of Andrew Wyeth's watercolors or casein paintings of trees that he did mid-stage in his career. And his technique is different. He's not using recognizable brush strokes, but he's really able to create the sort of light that he observed in Pennsylvania and create the character of the tree as well. Some really outstanding pieces of Andrew Wyeth come to mind as I'm thinking about how to portray this tree in an effective way. Starting to introduce some very strong darks now to, again, make some of the branches come towards us just a little more, create a stronger quality of light moving through the tree. And finishing off some of the branches that were placed with that earlier stage of yellow ochre. All the while, I'm trying to keep the touch sort of springy and a bouncing stroke, a broken stroke here and there. It's just something I like to do. It's sort of the way I like to paint, and I like when when that's evident in the final piece too. I am trying to leave a few highlights on the left side of the stones, which I can recapture with a little bit of white paint towards the end. But if I can leave some white paper there, it will look good too. Okay, well, things are starting to look finished. What I want to do at this stage is just regain a few lights that I either painted out or would like to see, some along the branches. I'm using a little bit of white paint for this, or Jaune Brilliant, which has that yellowish quality to it and is a little more in harmony with the painting. So I'm using the Jaune Brilliant to get an important edge here for the stone. This helps separate it from the tree visually a little more. It also helps to create the direction of the light a little more strongly. Just on a few edges where we see a little brightness. That's where this is effective. We don't want to outline the object. We don't want to use it too much because it can be chalky. But here and there, a little bit of brightness contributes to the feeling of light in the painting. And also, if you have one object passing in front of another, like a branch that's passing in front of another, just a little accent on the edge of the branch can make that more clear, more obvious. We'll also put a few leaves on the ground with the jaune brilliant, as though they've kind of been blown across the grass. And these are placed. We're not seeing these in the photograph. We're just placing them where they look good, like up against a stone or through a dark passage in the shadow. This is about as much as I'm going to add to the painting. These are the final touches. I might, if that yellow dries too bright, it's very easy to adjust with a touch of color. And now I compare those first washes and how they recede to the darks that we've added recently. I think it's time to put this one aside and take off the tape and have a look.